Hey everybody, Norm from Tested here, and once again with Brandon from Prop Store.
Yes.
Today, take a look at some of these items from your upcoming TV Treasures auction. Now, before we dive into these specific pieces, I want to hear more about your work with James Commissar, the collector, and what it was like to visit his collection. Like, how many props and costumes does he actually have?
Sure. Well, I have to tell you, I can't actually answer that question specifically because I haven't been to his facility. So he stores all of the artifacts in light and climate controlled storage, and he's very private about the storage. So actually, when we were putting the auction together, quite a big process to do it, really. I mean, we spent the majority of this year, 2018, assembling this auction, but it was really about a discussion between us and James of, what is Prop Store's focus? What are Prop Store's clients looking for? And what does James have in his archive that matches well with that? So, we really hit on sci-fi as a theme. We wanted to have a strong sci-fi focus to this auction. I think we certainly have that. We have the great shows like Batman that we looked at yesterday. We have Star Trek. We have a lot of content from Star Trek, the original series, which we'll talk about in a second. We have other titles like Planet of the Apes, Buck Rodgers, all the sort of classic American sci-fi shows. And that material always resonates well with collectors because the great thing about sci-fi is the props are custom made and people love custom made props, right?
Yeah. Well, let's dive right into it. And you mentioned Star Trek. There is something from Star Trek here. I can tell by the silhouette it's a Klingon disruptor.
Yes, yeah.
And so what is this from? Is it from the TV show, the film?
Yes, this is a very special piece because this is actually a Klingon disruptor from the original series from the 1960s. However, it was repainted, refinished for Star Trek the Motion Picture. So James acquired this from the family of Dick Rubin. Dick Rubin was the prop master on Star Trek the Motion Picture, which was the first feature film that they were going to do. When they started on that film, a lot of props came from Gene Roddenberry out of storage from the prior show, the 1960s show, and a few of those props were Klingon disruptors. So when you look at this piece, we can actually tell that the body is hand-carved wood, which is super cool, old school prop making. And you can see the wear and tear that exists on the wood underneath the modern sort of aquatone finishes. Now, when Dick Rubin's crew was prepping it for Star Trek the Motion Picture, they completely repainted it and they redid some of the metal work. So there are new detail plates on the side here that have a slightly different texture to them than the texture that it had in the 60s, but the bulk of the metal work is original. We've compared it to other examples that were unrestored from the 1960s, and you see exactly the same tones in the aluminum. For example, the tip here is darker than some of the other body sections, and I think Dick Rubin had a couple of these, and we've been able to authenticate it as dating back to Star Trek the original series. You can see here where the paint is chipped that it is indeed carved wood under that body.
That is so cool. I love that turned aluminum inset into, and it's so iconic of shows from the 60s and 70s. That is, a Star Trek blaster, disruptor.
Yeah, really sort of your classic phaser design, right? I mean, if you were to say, what does an outer space gun look like? I think it's about like this, right? Some machined aluminum details, this great little nozzle here at the front, and a very cool sort of organic carved handle.
That is super cool. You don't just have hand props from Star Trek. There are also costumes, I believe, as well. I see some even on the cover of the catalog.
Yes, so there's a great selection of Star Trek costumes in this catalog, and the really exciting thing about those is James Commissar got them all directly from William Ware Tice, who was the costume designer for Star Trek the original series, and I believe also for the early seasons of Star Trek The Next Generation. So he saved a lot of material, including these two very important costumes that we have on our auction catalog cover here. This is Kirk and Spock, William Shatner, and Leonard Nimoy from an episode called Plato's Stepchildren. And we believe these were one-offs. These were the only costumes made because they screen matched that episode. Again, they were retained by the costume designer, and Commissar got them straight from him. The reason this episode is so noteworthy is that it features one of the first ever interracial kisses on television between Shatner and Nichelle Nichols, Lieutenant Uhura. And this is actually the costume that he's wearing for that moment in television history. So pretty special piece there. Yeah,
and Star Trek had so many really colorful one-off costumes for their away missions. I remember a couple years ago there was a Star Trek costumes book that came out, and I flipped through that, and these are some of those costumes that are now available for auction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's over a dozen guest star costumes in the show. Very wild, sort of very 60s flamboyant costumes. We think most, if not all of them, were one-offs, meaning they were the only ones made based on the budget and the filming requirements at the time. Some of them have their accompanying costume sketches by William Ware Tice, and they're all going to be sold in the auction this Saturday.
Very cool. What else do you want to talk about
So a couple other things here, a couple other great hand props. This little one is from Buck Rodgers. This pistol was used by either Buck Rodgers or Wilma on the show, and this is actually a functional piece with electronics that still works. So if I push the trigger button here,
that is neat.
You get this great
right through the acrylic, and it blinks.
And a flash effect. How about that? That's the height of 1970s electronics right there. So that's a very cool piece, cast resin with electronics. You can see just a little 9-volt battery in the base of it there. And then over here, we have a locator device from Logan's Run. So after Logan's Run, the film, which I believe came out in 1976, they did a television series that ran for a few seasons. And this is one of the tracker props that was used in that show, which again would be custom made. There is a light bulb in the end. This one does not work, unfortunately. But just a great little simple hand prop that, you know, would have been a device to move the story forward in an episode of that show.
And a piece of costume because it clips onto the belt and
absolutely.
It was worn and used. Now, this clearly is a fake gun, you know, not a real gun, but what was this from?
So this is Planet of the Apes. And this, again, similar to Logan's Run, Planet of the Apes started as feature films and then there was a television series. This was probably used in both the feature films and the television series. It's actually carved wood. So this would have been a background gun, you know, when they're riding on horses, things like that. I know they also had metal versions that had real rifles in them when they needed to shoot, but this one probably would have had more use time because when they're not shooting them, they're using a static prop like this. It's got the original sling on it and very distinct Planet of the Apes styling, right?
And then finally, I do recognize this. This is from V.
Yes, this is V. This is one of the Shock Trooper helmets from V. Totally custom made from that show, and if you recognized it, then I think that says something about the recognizability of the design, right?
Yeah, yeah. So many iconic things. I know there are TV shows like Mork and Mindy. You guys have costumes from.
Yes.
You know, whether it's costumes or hand props or even, you know, scale models, it's all in here.
Yes, and a lot of sci-fi. You know, you touched on Mork and Mindy. We have the egg, which is also the egg that was used in Escape from New York, which is a very cool prop. And then another highlight of the sale, which is actually the back cover of the auction catalog, we have Uncle Martin's spaceship from My Favorite Martian. So this is a 10-foot spaceship made of fiberglass and metal, and it was completely custom designed and built for that show, apparently inspired by the Jaguar E-Type that had come out a few years earlier.
If I'm watching like TV Land or going through old Blu-rays of television shows, now I can really imagine like there's so many costumes and props for television. So many, and James Commissar has so much of it. That's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, this auction is really a celebration of television, the history of television. You know, there are dozens of shows represented here over something like a 60 or 70 year period. And it's not only sci-fi. Sci-fi is certainly a focus, but you've got comedy, you've got drama, you've got action, you've got all different types of shows represented in there. And I think, you know, for myself as a collector, going through the catalog is just a lot of fun. It's just fun to see this stuff. And for us at Prop Store, it's been very exciting to see some of the materials from television that we haven't worked with before, because as you touched on, our focus has traditionally been film over television.
And for TV, no matter what generation you are, you grew up with something.
Absolutely.
Right? And so these are all from the 60s, 70s, but also you have things from the 80s, the 90s, or even the early thousands.
Yes, yeah, no, that's right. I mean, there are shows like Boardwalk Empire, Sons of Anarchy, True Blood, you know, all these great modern shows as well. And the interesting thing is, I think television in some ways is more accessible than ever, right? You have Hulu and all these other platforms where people are going on to stream shows, both modern shows and older shows. So just because a show was made in the 1960s, like Star Trek, it doesn't mean its audience is limited to that time period. I think viewers today are finding those shows exactly the same way viewers found them 50 years ago. It's
so awesome to see these in person. Thank you so much, Brandon. We have one more day of featuring props from this auction, which is happening tomorrow, December 1st at
Prop Store in Valencia.
Prop Store in Valencia and
Come out and take a look.
propstore.com.
Yes.